Welcome to this lecture on plastic in the sea, a global problem. My name is Mirco Haseler. I work at the Leibniz-Institute for Baltic Sea Research in Warnemünde, Germany. A short overview of my lecture today. I will start with the marine litter definition, followed by some backgrounds about plastic litter, impacts, sources, sinks, study results, production numbers, and size classes of plastic. Then we're going to have a look at floating plastic on the sea surface, on plastic on the sea floor, and then we have a further look at the Baltic Sea and Mediterranean Sea, followed by a conclusion. So, what is marine litter? Marine litter is any persistent, manufactured, processed solid material that enters the marine environment due to human activities. It consists of items that have been made by people and were either deliberately discarded into the sea, rivers or on beaches, left by people on the beach or on the shore, brought indirectly into the sea by wind, sewage water or storm water and winds, or it was accidentally lost and, like fishing gear, ended up in the ocean. And plastic artificial polymers are responsible for approximately 70 to 90% of all the litter in the marine environment. So, impacts of marine litter and plastic litter. The damage from marine litter and from plastic litter was $18 billion in 2015, equating to $21 billion in 2020. And if the plastic production is keep on rising and increasing as predicted, this damage could be $230 billion in 2030 and $730 billion in 2050. But beside these economical impacts, there are many ecological impacts. Ingestion and entanglement of plastic. And in a study where 300 impacts on wildlife were investigated, 82% of these nearly 300 impacts were caused by plastic litter. So, where does it come from? The sources of marine plastic litter are mainly divided in two types: land-based litter and sea-based litter. Sea-based litter would be litter that is originating from fishing activities, for example, lost fishing gear, or litter from ships or platforms on the sea that get overboard and end up on the water surface or on the bottom of the sea. Litter could also come from harbors. This would count as land-based litter, the same as litter from wastewater treatment plants that enters the ocean through rivers. Also, agriculture could be a source of plastic litter, landfills, legal ones or illegal ones, and factories, beachgoers, or even cars. While driving, they lose microplastic from their car tires. And we're going to have a look on these land-based sources because they are approximately responsible for 80% of all the litter entering the marine environment. So, coastal areas are a very important source of plastic litter. And in 2010, it was estimated that alone 4.8 up to 12.7 million tons of plastic entered the ocean, and they were only generated by the population living 50 kilometers off the coast. In a recent update of such a study, it is now estimated that it's even 90 to 23 million tons of plastic entered the aquatic environments in 2016. That would be 11% of all the global waste, of the global plastic waste. And here we need more research to estimate the true amount of plastic entering the marine environment from coastal areas. Rivers are also a very important source of plastic. And between 1.1 and 2.4 million tons of plastic currently entered the ocean. And this alone, from 20 rivers, they are responsible for 67%, and these rivers are mostly in Asia. In another recent study, it was estimated that 1,000 rivers, often smaller urban rivers, are responsible for 80% of the global plastic emissions from rivers, and that these emissions are between 0.8 and 2.7 million tons per year. So we see also here more research is needed to estimate the real amount of litter that is entering the marine environment from rivers. So where does it end up? A lot of litter that is coming from land-based source ends up on the beach and accumulates within days or weeks. Further and smaller parts of plastic can be ingested by wildlife, and huge amounts are swimming on the water's surface. They sink down to the bottom, or they are somewhere in the water column between the water surface and the seafloor. And we're going to have a closer look on this today. So, first studies about plastic emissions and plastic particles on the sea surface were published in the 1970s. And two scientific publications in 1972 gained a lot of attention because there high amounts of plastic pellets and small plastic fragments below 5 millimeter were found on the coast of New England and in the Sargasso Sea. And already this 50 years ago, the authors said that with the increasing plastic production and the present waste management, the amount of plastic on the water surface of our oceans will definitely increase. And they were right. The plastic production nowadays is roughly 370 million tons per year, while it was only 1.7 million tons in 1950. And from all the plastic waste that was ever generated, only 9% were recycled. And approximately 79% of all the litter ends up in landfills or in the natural environment. And as the oceans are literally downhill from everywhere in the world, we can assume that more and more plastic entered the ocean and that the amount of plastic in the sea has certainly increased and will further increase in the future. So plastic is entering the ocean in different size classes. We have macroplastic that is larger than 25 millimeters, that could be bottles, chairs, other things. We have mesoplastic between 5 and 25 millimeters, often cigarette butts or bottle caps. And then we have smaller microplastics, large microplastic between 1 and 5 millimeter, and small microplastic below 1 millimeter. And these plastics are very durable. They can sustain in the environment for a long time. But even if they are very durable, they can degrade into smaller and smaller pieces due to the impact of heat, waves, UV radiation, or bacteria. And this leads to a further increase of microplastic in the oceans. So even if we would stop right away with littering plastic into the ocean, the plastic that is already there will fall into smaller and smaller pieces, and the amount of microplastic will increase over the next decades. So, as I said, this plastic is durable, and therefore it can be carried away by winds and ocean currents thousands of kilometers or 10,000 kilometers away from its entry point, ending up in the middle of the ocean, in these garbage patches. These garbage patches are gyres that are created by ocean currents and winds. And there's going to be a lot of plastic in these patches. We're going to have a closer look at the Great Pacific Garbage Patch. This is the biggest of these 5 patches. It is on the coast of the USA, and it is estimated that 75% in the total mass of the plastic there is macroplastic, so larger than 2.5 centimeters. But more than 1.1 up to 3.6 trillion pieces of microplastic is floating around. The microplastic is only responsible for 8% of the total mass, but for 94% of all the litter pieces there. So very tiny, small pieces. That means you could sail through such a gyre without seeing a huge amount of big pieces, because all the small litter is not visible for the naked eye. And it's estimated that roughly 80,000 tons of plastic are floating in this Great Pacific Garbage Patch alone. Having a look at floating plastic pollution all over the world, we can see that the median pollution of surface litter is 68 kilograms per square kilometer, but only 10 items. These are often larger items. But it can be up to 25,000 items per square kilometer, especially smaller plastic. But most of this study that you can see here on the map were done in coastal waters. So the southern hemisphere, there a lot of data is lacking, and especially in the coast or coastal areas of low-income countries, we don't have a lot of data. So we have this lack of data on the southern hemisphere, and we have a lack of data in terms of water, in terms of plastic in the water column, because most studies only investigating the fewer up meters from the water surface down. Having a look at seafloor plastic, the median pollution of macro seafloor litter is 2,000 kilograms per square kilometer and roughly 6,000 items per square kilometer. But most of these studies as well were done in coastal waters and shallow waters like the Baltic Sea, the North Sea or the Mediterranean Sea. So there's a lack of knowledge for the deep sea. And this is because these investigations of the deep sea or litter on the seafloor are extremely costly. And we need more information on the pollution of the deep sea to see how much plastic there is and if it is a final sink. For the Baltic Sea, as it is quite a shallow water, we have more data. Nearly 2,400 bottom trawls where the seafloor was investigated were done between 2012 and 2016. And here, in 47% of all the surveys, no litter was found. And the litter that was found was mostly natural products like processed wood, clinker or coal, and plastic was only responsible for 35% of all the litter found. And these 35% are much lower than the widely cited world average of 70 or 80% of plastic litter on the seafloor. But there are also other studies of the Baltic seafloor showing that up to 9.6 items were found per square kilometer, but even this higher amount is still very low compared to the North Sea, for example, where 71 items of plastic were found per square kilometer. So why do we have such a low amount of plastic on the Baltic seafloor? This is mostly to different reasons. The Baltic Sea, the average depth of the Baltic Sea is only 54 meters, so not very deep. And waves that are running through the beach start deformation already in a depth of 50 to 70 meters. So this wave action transports the plastic further to the coast. It leads to a fragmentation of plastic from bigger to smaller pieces, but it also transports the plastic to the coast. And this is why we don't have such a high pollution in the shallow waters of the Baltic Sea. Having a look at plastic litter on the surface of the Baltic Sea coming from rivers and from wastewater treatment plants, small microplastic was investigated, and the model approach showed that most of this microplastic will accumulate within days or weeks on the coast. You can see this on the map. The darker areas show the higher concentration of microplastics, and these are mostly in the coastal areas. So most of the plastic that is swimming on the surface of the Baltic Sea will accumulate on coast. This is for microplastic. And this is done by the currents that are pushing the plastic to the beaches. For larger plastic that is swimming on the surface, mostly the wind is the predominant source to push the plastic to the coast. In a study and in a modeling approach, it was shown that litter from sea-based sources, like from shipping lines, that is entering the sea, is mostly pushed to the northern coast, so to the Scandinavian coast, and is accumulating there on the beach. And this transport of the larger plastic on the sea surface is driven by winds. For the Mediterranean Sea, there is a higher amount of plastic on the seafloor, up to 100,000 items per square kilometer. And most of it is plastic and fishing gear. And this amount of plastic were mostly in the first 100 meters of the shore. And also on the water column, the highest amount of plastic was found 1 kilometer off the shore. That means that also here in the Mediterranean Sea, most of the litter is land-based, staying close to the entry point. This is called the boomerang effect. And in the majority of the Mediterranean Sea states, 60% of the plastic that is in their coastal areas is actually coming from their own terrestrial land-based sources. So there is no long-term accumulation of plastic on the water surface in the Mediterranean Sea, but in the deeper areas of the Mediterranean Sea, there's a lot of litter and plastic litter on the seafloor. But as you can see here on the map, most of the studies were done in the northern part of the Mediterranean Sea, and there's a lack of data for the southern North African coasts. And as these surveys of floating plastic litter are expensive, and the surveys of plastic litter on the seafloor are even more expensive, we assume that beach litter monitoring is the most effective and cost-effective way to gather pollution data for the North African countries of the Mediterranean Sea. Coming to the conclusions. Plastic pollution costs us billions of dollars each year to clean up beaches, for example, but it also has a lot of negative impacts on the wildlife due to ingestion and entanglement. The estimated amount of plastic that enters the sea from land-based sources like coastal areas and rivers does not generally fit with the amount of plastic found in the marine environment. So more research is needed to figure out how much plastic is really entering the sea from land-based sources, but also more research is needed where are the final sinks of many of these plastic particles. We saw that the global ocean, like the Atlantic or the Pacific, is capable of accumulating floating plastic litter on the surface in these garbage patches for a long, long time. This is not the case for the Baltic or the Mediterranean Sea, where most of the litter will float to the beach or sink to the bottom in the Mediterranean Sea, to the beaches in the Baltic Sea. And therefore, the most effective way to gather pollution data is beach monitoring, as it is easy and cost-effective. And this is especially the case for North African countries of the Mediterranean Sea, where there's a lack of data at the moment. There's also a lack of data for the plastic pollution in the deep sea, so further studies are needed there. And the increasing plastic production with the present waste management will lead to a higher pollution of the marine environment in the next decades. And therefore, it is urgent that plastic litter prevention strategies are invented and implemented. And with this, I would like to thank you for your attention.